You're listening to Changing Reality. Changing Reality, where we bend reality all across the world. Only on WQHS Radio. So hi everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Changing Reality. Welcome one, welcome all. We're so glad to have you here. So if this is your first time watching the show, where have you been all your life? This is the place to be. But anyway, as I said, welcome to Changing Reality. We are a show that features phenomenal people from all walks of life who are in essence changing their own reality. So through this show, we'll be hanging out and interviewing social change makers, entrepreneurs, business owners, thought leaders, industry experts, to even artists, musicians, and inspiring individuals from all across the world and from right here on the Penn campus. And this is part of our very special, I would say, series, or this month's theme, where we're actually interviewing amazing professors from the Penn and Wharton campus as well, to have their stories out there for you guys to learn from as well. So I am a true believer in the power of stories. I believe that by hearing these inspiring stories on how everyday people are changing the reality around them, we get to pick up these little nuggets of wisdom that could helpfully, or at least hopefully, help us in our own lives in a way and help us craft those paths for our own selves. And I wanted to do this show simply because I feel like there are a lot of people out there who do phenomenal things and make waves in the lives of those around them. And I want to uncover those stories so that you and I can learn from them and use them as the stepping stone to the things that we want to do. So personally, to show you how much I believe in stories in a sense, I actually founded and run a youth movement called Ascendance, which is a social enterprise back home in Malaysia, which is where I'm from, that today collaborates not just with our Malaysian Ministry of Education, but actually works with over 28 different countries to help provide an alternative education platform for any student who wants to change their reality. So we work with students from elementary all the way up to college through various sessions, programs, experiential learning sessions that help them discover what they love doing, learn about themselves and the world around them, and start their own careers while they're still in school. That creates meaningful impact not just for themselves, but for those around them as well. And to date, we've been lucky to work with over 35,000 students from 970 communities and have incubated countless number of student-run projects and social enterprises run by students aged 8 to 25 years old themselves. And the basis for all of that has been stories, has been listening to people from different points of view, from different levels of experience in a way, and being able to contextualize that in our own lives and build on the lessons that they've gone through. So just like that, I hope that this show is that same platform for all of you, that by listening to this, you get to figure out a little bit more about yourself and you get to figure out what this means in context of your own journey. So if you want to talk about anything specific, if there are any topics that you want to address or any people you want to speak to, do let me know in the comments below. You can let us, you can recommend stuff and we'll try our best to make it happen for you. So today's speaker is someone who is absolutely amazing. We have a professor from Wharton who actually studies hybrid ventures, which are organizations that combine related but potentially contradictory aims at their core in a sense. So think, for example, of social enterprises, which on one hand are amazing. They create huge social impact, but also have their business objectives, and they are to an extent for profits in a sense. Though we also have examples from nanotechnology, where startups are organized around scientific discovery, but also technological commercialization. So he focuses on really looking at these intersections between multiple or conflicting aims in that organizations in a sense. And he works with them, because obviously these are the organizations of the future, to research on how these hybrid organizations emerge, how they attract their resources, and how they positively affect society. So the list of awards and accolades for his research and work are plentiful, from the Research Impact on Practice Award that recognizes a piece of contemporary peer-reviewed research that has important implications for practice back in 2017, to the inaugural IACMR Presidential Award in 2018. And he's even won several Best Paper awards, including being recognized as the best paper at the 13th Annual Social Entrepreneurship Conference. And as I said, the list of the many, I would say, recognitions that he has received has gone on and on. He's been featured in Forbes, many great publications. And just like that, he's on our show today to take your questions, to share his experiences with you guys. So without further ado, let's welcome our amazing guest speaker for today, Professor Tyler. Hello. Hi, Professor. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Harsha, how are you?
All right, can't complain. I guess we're entering summer, so that is always a great thing. Oh, even though I'm actually from a tropical country, so it's technically summer all year round for me wherever I go. But yeah.
And I'm from Northern Canada, so it's the opposite for me. So it's winter like
What?
9 months of the year where I'm from. So, even this sort of stilted entry into summer we're having in Philadelphia still feels pretty good to me.
So okay, good. I'm gonna completely backtrack from our conversation just to focus on that in a second. So how is summer like you like where you're from in Canada in a sense? Is it still, a little cold or do you at least get some sunshine?
So you definitely get sunshine. So it's so far north, you get a lot of daylight, right? And
Okay.
so the days are very long. And I mean, a good summer day, the high will get up to about 80 degrees. And so it's really great, but it's really short, right? Like you only have 2 months of it tops, like July, August, and then, you're back into the fall. And there's also mosquitoes, which are not great. But everyone goes outside, and it's really wonderful for a couple of months. But the rest of the year, it's dark, cold, and a little bit tough.
Okay. Again, I'm completely like the audience is gonna be terribly disappointed for not jumping into the crazy social entrepreneurship thing. But I've got to ask, so how is a typical day in like winter for you? Like growing up, would you like is there complete darkness or like explain to the audience who are as dumb as I am and as less traveled as I am? Yeah.
Oh, you're not dumb, and I'm sure you're very widely traveled. Very few reasons to go to where I grew up in Edmonton, Canada. I mean, a great place to be from, I always say, right? Like it was a good community to grow up in, and I'm also happy that I, got out in later life. It's winter's tough. You would wake up and it would be dark, and you would go to school, and you'd be inside all day, and then by like 4 p.m. it'd be dark again. So you'd have very cold, not much light. A lot of people struggled with seasonal affective disorder. So you get one of these sad lamps, and it shoots little rays of vitamin D at you instead of getting normal sunlight, and you muddle through.
Very Game of Thrones winter is coming vibe. And very scary for those who have never experienced winter like me. Okay. All right. I'll brace myself if we ever go and visit. But very
I'll
interestingly, since
visit
we're
in the summer if you go. It's lovely in the summer. Winter, stay away. Yeah.
stay away. Okay. Just out of the travel plans. Got it.
Yeah.
But speaking of where you're from, in a sense, before we jump into all of the heavy stuff, I always like to talk a little bit about how you actually got interested in the stuff that you are doing right now. And I actually heard from somewhere that you actually heard about entrepreneurship, got into, or at least got interested in it at a very young age while you were still in school, if I'm not mistaken. How in this, and I'm imagining now this cold and scary and barren days, how did you come across entrepreneurship and or at least think about it as something that you wanted to pursue?
If I look way back to my youth, I was interested in entrepreneurship because I saw it as a way to get rich. And so, my mom had this book, still has it somewhere. And it was like, every year, what do your kids want to do when they grow up? Why do they want to do it? And she showed me mine. And it was like, I started off like I wanted to be a firefighter or a policeman or some sort of a community helper. And then when I turned about 8 or 9, I was like, I want to be an entrepreneur. I want to be a lawyer. I want to be in finance because I want to be rich. Uh, and so didn't come to entrepreneurship from the most sort of noble motives, but got really interested in, sort of the web 1.0, how you could, take an audience online, monetize it, raise capital, and hopefully flip it for some money. And so when I was, undergrad, doing my first degree, that's what I was really focused on. So my grades were terrible. I almost never went to class. I was always just trying to start something. And so, had a few that got up off the ground, but I was just, I was ignorant in every way of the process, right? Like I was ignorant about how you create a venture. And I was also ignorant to the fact that trying to create like a VC grade venture in Northern Canada, there's just a mismatch, right? Because there's no ecosystem to support that. So,
Oh,
there's no VCs to talk to. There's no investment forthcoming. we raised some friends and family money, but the burn rate was really high, and we couldn't ever get to anything that justified the initial cash outlay. Yeah, so I came to it as an instrumental profit seeker, and made a reasonable run at it, even if didn't end up meeting that goal of getting rich.
This is a very ironic story. I am very confused. I'm sure the audience is as well, because now you focus a lot on social entrepreneurship, and kind of like these, as we said a little bit in your intro, conflicting, I would say, aims within business organizations. So we mentioned nanotech, which has this amazing scientific kind of, I would say, impact, and then social entrepreneurship, which of course gets right to the ground, really has that sort of that ESG kind of impact. So how did you kind of flip from entrepreneurship to social entrepreneurship in a sense? It is a small, I would say, meander in terms of the word, but a huge meander in terms of actually the way you think about it. So were you struck by lightning? What happened?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it was always really latent in me. So, I was always a really empathetic person, and I always wanted to do things that help people. But there was that period in my life where I sort of viewed these as, different parts of myself, right? So there was like the charitable part, involved in the church, different philanthropies. Then there was the business side, which was, let's just get rich. And I kept them apart for a long time, like parallel paths, and I'd specialize on one or the other, but in different sort of segments of my life. What really sort of brought me to this moment where I realized that just entrepreneurship for the sake of making money wasn't going to be something that was how I actually wanted to spend my life. Was working on a venture, and I had a co-founder who, in retrospect, he was probably a sociopath. Entrepreneurship does tend to attract a lot of people who are sociopathic, for better or for worse. And he was just the kind of person who would, step on your neck if he thought that it would get him ahead. And it left a really bad taste in my mouth. So I got out of that venture, and I thought, if I can't do something with my life that brings these two pieces of what I want to accomplish together, then it's not going to be, the fulfilling sort of journey I want to be on. And so I made this very thoughtful pivot to try and use business for a force for good. And so I got linked up with the Canadian Centre for Social Entrepreneurship. I sat on their board of advisors for a number of years. We started a social enterprise incubator. Nothing big ever came out of it, but it was a good exposure to people who were, a few steps ahead of me on the growth curve, the personal growth curve, and really trying to use venture as a source for good. And I keep in touch with some of those people that I met back then, and a few of them have, since then done really amazing things, even if, the incubator had no treatment effect in practice. Yeah. And so it just got me thinking, there's got to be a better way to use business than just this tool for profit seeking, for private gain, private wealth creation. And it was a great move. It's been a really fulfilling path to be on. And it's obviously, landed me somewhere I never thought I would be, which is, as a professor. I never thought I'd be an academic. It was so far down on my list. But studying how this stuff works and trying to, create an impact by helping people who are on the front lines now.
No, that's an amazing story. And I totally agree of how fulfilling and amazing social entrepreneurship is. I remember I was in this conference on social entrepreneurship, and this person just came out there and they said, social enterprise should not exist. And not just me, I think the whole audience was like, why shouldn't it? And they were like, well, because all businesses should be social businesses, and nobody should think any different from it in a sense, because that sets kind of like the objectives of having some impact in the community way up there. So definitely something that I believe in strongly, and will hopefully not be shocked by any conference goers and speakers anytime soon into being tricked into believing people thought differently in a sense. Tell me, and you mentioned that being a professor was not on the list of things. Oh gosh, that's terrible. Where did it rank, before or after firefighter? I'm very confused. But I read somewhere you actually quoted that the life of in academia is similar to that of venture, in a sense that you think through the venture, you work on it, and then you bring it into creation in a sense. How did you end up in this path of kind of becoming a professor, doing the research, if it wasn't something that you intended to do in a sense? Tell me a bit about that portion of your journey.
Yeah, I mean, it came from a realization of my own ignorance. I don't think I learned a ton from all of the failures I had when I was trying to just be a profit-seeking entrepreneur, but I did realize that I had a lot to learn. So, it pushed me down that path. And I thought, if I'm going to do this, sort of social enterprise thing, I need to learn more about like how you do it, both on the social side and on the business side. And so I started looking for MBA programs that had both of those features, sort of embedded in them. And I couldn't find anything. I mean, I think the only place I found, HBS was doing some stuff back in the day where if you, went into the nonprofit charitable sector after graduating, they'd do some like tuition forgiveness or something. But it wasn't like it is now, where there is more infrastructure around social enterprise and, impact and all of these things. And so I thought, well, okay, what I'll do is I'll hack something together. I'll do a master's degree in sociology to try and, get a better fix on the impact piece. And then I'll do an MBA to, get a better fix on how to actually be a successful entrepreneur. And so I did my MA, which was a research degree. And I really liked research. I liked ideas. I liked thinking deeply and narrowly about things. And I just kind of caught the bug. And so when I finished that, I thought, okay, well, instead of an MBA, maybe I'll do a PhD, because that seems to be something, it sort of aligns with what I find fulfilling. Still the plan was never to be a professor. I just wanted to, deepen my knowledge and be an entrepreneur. Actually, the only thing that I was ever a part of launching that succeeded, I did during my PhD, but that's a whole different story. But yeah, did my PhD, and it had a pretty strong treatment effect on me, because they, if they're going to invest in you as a student, they want you to go out and get an academic job. And then ended up going on the academic job market when I was close to graduation, and then I got hired at Wharton. And by the time that happened, it was like, okay, well, I guess this is happening. I should probably just lean in. I'm still not 100%.
Like, since the best business school in the world offered me a job, I guess I'll give it a shot. That was the thought process.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds crazy, but yeah, it was. I was talking with my wife about it. And I was like, I think this sounds kind of interesting. We'll have to move to Philadelphia, and that was an interesting conversation. But I was like, if I don't do this, I'll probably regret it, and probably won't have many more on-ramps, to have the chance again. Yeah. And so, did it, and, I've been here for 10 years, got tenure. Yeah. So it's going to be the long-term plan now.
All right. I'm glad they got to you before, like, I don't know, any other university could. Like, thankfully, we have you to set other social entrepreneurs on the right path so that they don't have to, I don't know, figure and mix and match stuff on their own. Tell me a bit about that initial, I would say, since there wasn't much of a let's focus on social entrepreneurship kind of a like path at that point of time. How did you go about deciding what you wanted to do your dissertation on? How do you decide like what you wanted to really focus on in those initial stages? I know you did, I think, one of your initial papers on nanotechnology. Correct me again if I'm wrong. But how did that even, like, that's not something that a normal person thinks like, I'm gonna think about nanotechnology today. So how did those ideas come to you at that very early stage?
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of people were a part of the journey. So I'd like to say, there's some epiphany, and I thought, oh, nanotechnology, that's the thing. And I started doing research and writing on nanotech. But I mean, it was much more embedded in the environment I was in doing my PhD. So I mean, in terms of my overall orientation in life, I sort of view it as setting a loose vector. So I'm going in a general direction I'm happy with, but then I try and be, opportunistic and sort of open to, the different things that are, come to you in the environment that are not part of the plan. And so when I was doing my PhD, I was always interested in doing something around like ESG, corporate social responsibility, social entrepreneurship. And I ended up working with this really brilliant supervisor named Mike Lounsbury, who, I still keep in touch with. And he had a grant to study nanotechnology. So he was recruited from Cornell, and the university I was at, University of Alberta, the only way they could get him was to, just basically give him a blank check to study nanotechnology as a part of the Canadian government's initiative to try and understand like the social side of nanotech. It didn't become like the next genetically modified organism kind of thing, right? Where there's all this public backlash. And so because Mike had this huge grant and I was his student, he said if that I wanted to study nanotech, I could just have like a blank check to do research with him. And I thought, well, this sounds really good. And all it takes is a little bit of abstraction theoretically to see how the underlying principles also relate to something like social enterprise, right? So in nanotech, you have these startup firms that are doing like scientific research, but also trying to commercialize. And these goals don't always play nicely together, right? There's different incentives, there's different, funding structures. And in terms of how they hit the market, it's different as well. So it's a lot like a social enterprise where you have social and financial goals, and you got to find a way to make them play nice and not create tensions that tear the organization apart. And so, it ended up being a good move. Mike and I published a few things off the nanotech data, even though it was never like a context that I was in love with. But it gave me a chance to work on theoretical ideas, in an environment where I wasn't struggling for resources. That then could really set the foundation to be applied to something like social enterprise, which is much more sort of, enriching and fulfilling as a context to study for me.
Oh, amazing. And I like how you kind of use those foundations, as you said, and kind of applied them in the work that you do in social enterprise. So let's move a little bit on the timeline of the journey. So you're at Wharton, you come to this brilliant, beautiful campus, and you meet these horrible teenagers. Joking, we're amazing, like, right? And you meet these hopefully, I would say, brilliant students in a sense. Since you never wanted to be a professor, how were your first few classes in a sense of really figuring out how, like, what you wanted to deliver and how you wanted to get that across? I'm sure that's something that comes naturally from you, and that you're amazing at. But when you first started, what was kind of like your initial approach to it in a way?
It's fun to think back to it. I mean, fun, but also sort of horrifying because, you say that I must have been, a natural at it, and I wasn't at all. I always sort of like the idea of teaching, but until you start as a professor, you don't get a lot of experience doing it. And then I didn't quite understand what I was walking into at Wharton. So the only little bit of teaching experience I'd had was undergrads at the University of Alberta, which is, it's where I went. It's a
nice, great, smart people, not the atrocious little, no, okay.
Well, it's a different draw, right? It's a regional university. It's probably the best one in, Western Canada, the prairies at least. But it's not the same sort of like international draw as a place like, Penn or Harvard, MIT, Stanford, right? Where you're really getting like the international elite coming in. And so I thought, well, as long as I'm one class ahead of the students, I'll, do my lectures and they'll love me and this will be great. And it turns out that was not the case.
Okay.
My teaching evaluations in the first year weren't awful, but there was a couple comments like this guy should get fired. Like, I can't believe Penn standards have slipped this far. And it was kind of a sobering moment for me. So in terms of what I was teaching, it was entrepreneurship. And so, I was teaching, stuff that I had the academic background with, but I wasn't as exposed to the finance side at that time. And so, a lot of the students had some pretty strong opinions about, private equity, venture capital. And I said some, derogatory things from my personal experience, which was very limited, but, definitely crystallizing. And so they didn't like that. But it's gotten a lot better since. And I really do enjoy teaching. The undergrads at Penn especially are just so bright, curious, earnest, hardworking. There's variance, of course. Some students are just a massive pain in the ass. But in general, just wonderful people to work with. And so I really do like it.
No, that's amazing to hear. And I'm sure all the undergrads listening to this are probably just going to try to be better and nicer in their evaluations after this to their professors.
I sincerely doubt that.
Okay, I hope that's my sincere hope for this episode. At the very least, guys, be a little bit nicer. If I got that, I'd cry like straight away. Uh, tell me a bit
It
about
was tough.
how. Well, one of the conversations I was having with in this series that we're doing to being professors is there was on the previous episode someone said very interesting, which is every professor has their own style in a sense, and that's something that they form from kind of the trial by fire of working with people or students specifically, and it evolves as they teach in a sense. How do you start to figure out what your style is, in terms of like the way that you work with students, the way that you conduct those classes? And I'm sure this wasn't something that you consciously thought of, like, oh, today I will implement this way of speaking or anything. But how do you come about kind of like finding that middle ground, or at least that the space where you are now, where you actually have amazing classes? I know that you had this thing where you even give like was it $20 that you invest in students, and then they turn that into like actual like profit making or profit generating ideas. So you do so many cool stuff. How do you actually start bringing those out and thinking about that and incorporating that into your teaching?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of that came out of my experience in the first year, because in that first year, I just took the syllabus of the person who had taught the class before me, dusted it off, and was really teaching someone else's content. And I think that was part of the reason why it wasn't a great experience for me or the students. So then after that, I started thinking more entrepreneurially about like what I could do in the class, which would be interesting for the students, but also fun for me. And so that was sort of the genesis of the $5 venture creation thing. Was it? It was a while ago I did that. Yeah, it's either 5 or 20. But anyway, a tiny bit of startup capital and seeing what students can turn it into. Bringing activities into the classroom. I don't love case teaching, so I don't do a lot of that. I prefer to have people just work on ventures and have that be like a live case. But then I think, sort of the biggest stylistic change for me over the years has been to kind of get out of my own way when it comes to evaluating ventures. And instead of sitting there like trying to judge people's ventures, which is never great because people have a lot of themselves invested in their ideas. And if you tell them their baby is ugly, I mean, it hurts, right? It's an uncomfortable conversation, even if it's true. And so what I try and do now is I try and just give any students I'm working with the tools to figure it out on their own, and then any kind of supports I can to help them along that process, right? So instead of me saying your idea is bad, I encourage them to go out and get the data and figure out for themselves if it's good or bad, and then like update their priors based on validated knowledge. And some people never get there. They continue to think their ideas are a lot better than they actually are. But some people, they come to the realization that their idea needs to change if it's going to be successful. Other people quit. And then there's other ones where, I was just sure that this was the dumbest idea to ever fall off a turnip truck. And it turns into something great, right? Like there's so much uncertainty around all this stuff, you never know. So, I've given up trying to call balls and strikes. I just want to see data, evidence, and I want people to come to these conclusions on their own.
Okay, I'm glad to know that there is some hope for our entrepreneurship students in a sense. And you work with a lot of students, I think, from undergrad to MBA. Tell us about. I wouldn't say okay. It'd be hard for me, or it'd be terrible of me to ask you to pick favorites among the students that you work with. But tell us about some of your favorite stories in the sense of working with these students. I know that you advise some of these student startups even after they're done with their classes in a sense. So tell me a bit, maybe one or two stories that you felt like the most, I would say, I wouldn't say impressed with, but the ones that were most impactful to you.
The ones that I like the most are the ones where I keep in touch with the students. And then, so one of the myths about venture, just to rewind a little bit, is that it's a quick process where you have an idea, you go raise capital, you go to market, then you start to build and scale. In actual fact, like 90% of the entrepreneurs I've ever worked with, they spend about, a year, 18 months just in dark development R&D mode, where they're just trying to figure out if they can build a trap that'll catch mice. And so I really find it enriching to stay in touch with students, after I've taught a class, help them, where I can as they, continue their journey, and then see them succeed. And then I love having them back to be guest speakers in subsequent classes. So whenever I'm looking for a speaker, I always look to former students first, because they can, they can talk about what it was like to sit in that same seat and, think they have it all figured out, and then, actually go out and try and do something and get knocked around a bit, and actually have to be gritty, resilient, and make it happen. So, I've ended up with some good friends out of that process. And it's just so amazing and enriching to see, what they managed to create. And I take very little credit for any of it. But I'm always just so honored and humbled when I can be a part of that journey where someone builds something great.
Okay. That is heartwarming to hear, and great to know that if we take a class, we'll hopefully bump into an alumni who literally was in our shoes at one point of time or another. So I guess for those who haven't signed up for your classes in the fall, this is the push for them to do that in a sense. And because I personally would definitely love to. Another question is kind of like something else that I saw in another interview that you did. You mentioned that there is a segment of students that come in at the undergrad level, at least, who end up, I would say, and I joke about this all the time, that so many people come into Penn as social entrepreneurs and they leave in finance and consulting. And then I saw you say something similar in an interview. I was like, okay, I've got to ask you about that in a sense. That is very heartbreaking for me as a social entrepreneur to see, like, a lot of my friends, we started out in freshman year, like in the same like stuff that we like. And then by kind of entering junior year, they've already decided, this isn't so much for me in a sense. And they go off into something that I think fits a bit more into kind of like the whole point or kind of the whole push that the ecosystem of recruiting is trying to get them into, in a sense. Have you ever seen this among students in your class? And how do you, I would say, braced for the heartbreak of that, or at the very least, what are your thoughts in kind of like people who want to be social entrepreneurs but maybe get influenced by external noise in that process?
Yeah, I mean, like tale as old as time at Penn, right? Like, people come in, they want to change the world, and they leave as, cogs in the machine. And, more power to them, right? Like, if I came in as an undergrad to Wharton, I am 90% confident that I would go out into finance, right? Because there's just so many pressures, right? Like, you're being streamed towards that, the rewards are so high, right? Like, the salaries are, really nice straight out of school. You get a bonus. All your friends are doing it. You go live in New York and just, love life, right? So, more power to them. If people want to do that, that's great. And, I wish them all the best. The people who stick with social entrepreneurship are the ones that are the true believers, right? Because it is a massively hard path to go down. So starting any kind of venture is hard. And you're going to end up graduating and you'll be eating ramen noodles as your friends are living the high life, with financing and consulting salaries in New York. And then if you're doing something in social enterprise, you have the additional challenge of trying to build the social mission in, which could make the whole go-to-market tougher, right? And so on the far end, you end up with social entrepreneurs who are doing something in the nonprofit space, who have all of the grief, misery, and hardship of trying to start something entrepreneurial. And then they don't even have the profit potential on the other side, right? Like, they're going to be eating ramen noodles for life, which, as a personal choice, is tough to make. But, this is where you find really impactful stuff, right? Because it's people who are absolutely passionate about doing something that makes the world a better place. And so they stick with it, they grind, they adapt, they learn, and they actually end up building amazing things. And so, you'd asked me a little earlier about, some gratifying stories of working with students. The ones that I get the most gratification out of are, I've had the pleasure to be a faculty advisor to 3 teams of social entrepreneurs that have won the President's Engagement Prize. And, these are students who have, made the decision while they were at Penn to start something in the social entrepreneurship space, consciously build a nonprofit. And then by the time they're graduating, they're sitting at the precipice of doing something really impactful. And then they get this little bit of money to do it with. And they can go off and, make an actual run at it. And I mean, for me, that's just amazing, because these are people who are going to go out and change the world. And, if all I do is just cheerlead and, offer them my support, I love it. It's just a really amazing process to be close to.
Well, I'm sure you do a lot more than that for them, but I understand the sentiment. That is amazing to hear in a way. We can't end this episode, I feel, if we don't talk about your research and the amazing things that you've done to uncover this world of social entrepreneurship. But I guess we have to start off with the one question that I think most people ask when it comes to social entrepreneurship is social entrepreneurship really profitable in a way? And I know the answer is yes, obviously, because I'm extremely biased towards social entrepreneurship. And if anyone says otherwise, they will be immediately exited from my call. But essentially, in a way, the question when social entrepreneurship essentially comes out is, number one, are those trade-offs, and you said it yourself, I think, in some of your work, that there's never an exactly reciprocal relationship between scale and impact in a sense. Your impact and scale is never exactly the same in a sense. And there will be pivots and positions where you have to make those trade-offs in a sense. How, in your opinion, in all of the work that you've done, do you think that, number one, a social enterprise can navigate those trade-offs to be as successful as it would be if it had just focused on the for-profit aspect of it and completely on the maximizing of profits?
It's a super interesting question. And I think the answer is kind of nuanced. So, I mean, top line, yes, of course, you can have a very impactful business that creates profits. But you start to dig a little bit underneath that. And, there's a lot of variance in social enterprises. So there's kind of like the right tail example. And, one of the people on the Wharton board of, it's not overseers anymore, I think it's board of advisors now. His name is Bobby Turner, and he operates Turner Impact Capital. And he has an amazing investment thesis that is also incredibly impactful, right? And so, his insight was, if you take problems like, poverty, bad education, health, these aren't going away, right? Housing is the other one he focuses on. And so if you can find a way to de-risk investments in these spaces, then, you can get really nice investment adjusted returns, right? Because you're creating things where there are, good recurring revenue streams and the problem's not going away. So there's a lot of demand, right? So there's a market. And, there's all sorts of social entrepreneurial projects that, Bobby funds through Turner Impact Capital that make a really wonderful return financially and have a really high social impact. And so, I mean, that's right tail stuff, right? And you could put stuff like, ed tech, some fintechs, green power, kind of ventures over in that space. And they can be profit seeking, right? They could operate internally like any other profit seeking organization. But because their outputs are inherently beneficial, they create impact, right? Now, on the other end of the continuum, you have like a microfinance organization where the benefits of the microfinance loan only become unlocked if you have support programs for the borrowers, right? Like teach them how to start a venture, how to do basic bookkeeping, how to save money, all of these things that, sort of are the mechanisms that would link, little bits of finance to little bits of actual impact. Well, I mean, this stuff is costly, right? So there is a direct trade-off in that context. And it gets tough, right? Because organizations that are like that, where they're blending the mission, but the social mission is actually costly, there's going to be times where you got to decide, right? Like, am I going to make the decision now for the sustainability and the profitability of the organization, or am I going to make it to have a higher impact? And this stuff gets tough, right? There's no easy answers. There's things that we found out in research that, can help organizations survive, through these trials and tribulations, but it's tough, right? And then between the two continuums, you have all sorts of stuff, right? Where there's varying degrees of tensions, trade-offs, profits and impact.
No, very, very real answer, I would say. If you had given just a yes or no answer, I think that would not have worked as well as that in a sense. And you're right, there are many various degrees in between that navigate it. You also published something, I think, a couple of years ago on essentially how communities have benefited from corporate giving in a sense, and how I would say corporations in their efforts of giving to relief funds, to supporting a lot of the social and the necessities around the world, have actually made up a huge portion of relief aid and all that, which is amazing to hear. an argument that often comes to me, or at least that I often hear people say about social entrepreneurship is, or when they're choosing whether to pursue social entrepreneurship or directly profit-oriented entrepreneurship in a sense, would be, I would just focus on building my business now and do that really, really well. And then when we're successful, we'll be able to give back more in a sense, instead of just going out from ground up as a social enterprise. That's an argument that I often hear. Maybe I'm not arguing with the right people, but what are your thoughts on that in a sense? And what do you think are the benefits or the, I would say, the drawbacks of each option in a sense?
It's a really good question. This actually gets at a really fascinating line of research that was catalyzed by a professor here at Penn named Phil Tetlock. And, the insight that came out of Phil's work, I mean, one stream of his work, 'cause he's prolific, is that, when you're doing something like social enterprise or anything where you're trying to combine goals that don't go easily together, the longer you spend grappling with that, the more nuanced your thinking becomes. And you go from thinking that's integratively simple, which is just like trade-off reasoning, right? Like if I have more of this, I have to accept less of that, to more integratively complex ways of thinking. And so one way of thinking about the compatibility between like social and financial goals that is more integratively complex is to think about the temporal aspect, right? Which is exactly what these people you're debating with are advocating for, right? So to get this off the ground, to actually start something that can sustain itself from an operational perspective, we can't have the social goal now. But once we get to a certain point, then we can unlock the potential to roll this piece in, right? Like the risk with that strategy is you become path dependent and locked in on just the financial side of things, and the social never comes. But, high level, this is, it can be pretty sophisticated thinking, right? You can also think about, the social and the financial can come together, but only if there's like some real innovation in both of them to make them symbiotic as opposed to conflicting. Or maybe it's, you need to change some third variable. So, you have social, you have financial, but the only way to make them play nicely with each other is to change the context where you're trying to mix them, right? So then the approach of the strategy is like you work on policy or education or other things that set the conditions up for the two goals to be put together, right? So it's not a bad strategy, right? Like I said, there's some risk that you don't actually follow through in the second part, but it can be a pretty nuanced and clever way of thinking about some tricky problems.
Yeah, but I do know some amazing entrepreneurs who have been who've never really given much thought to the social aspect of the work that they're doing. But then after 5-6 years of actually running an extremely successful business, and you know what, I'm going to pivot. I'm going to add some social element to it, whether it's internally or whether it is embedded in the nature of the work that they do. And sometimes that's better off because now they have a deeper understanding in a sense for that community that they're serving in a sense. So it's easier for them to really bring out and do good for those people because they have the data, they have the support, they have the structures in place, and they've already at the position which they can do that. On the flip side, you also mentioned that there is a risk that these companies don't follow through on their stuff. You also did, I think, a recent business roundtable, I think about a year or so ago, or a bit later, on the pandemic specifically, on how large corporations, on whether they followed up on kind of their commitments to helping people. And I think sometimes having a pandemic every now and then is a good thing because it gets you have a literal disaster and you can see how people reacted in a disaster in front of your eyes in a sense. Tell us a little bit about your findings in that arena in a sense. Did everyone really do exactly what they said they would? Did they pledge all of their relief? Or was there a bit of leeway in that in a sense?
So can I swear on your podcast, or is that like
PG-13?
I'll keep it clean. Okay.
So
it's no problem. No problem. You'll understand where I was going with this in a second. So the business roundtable stuff was interesting because I had been curious for a while whether or not this, big commitment where the roundtable signatories, said that they were going to, change the meaning of shareholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism. Was that actually worth more than the paper it was written on? And so, when the pandemic struck, we started to gather data on what the corporate responses were. And there's some interesting variance within the different signatories to the roundtable statement. But the punchline was, the overall effect was, signatories to this statement were not nearly as responsive, following, like the initial lockdowns with COVID in responding to stakeholder needs, right? So, despite all of their lofty rhetoric about, capitalism is about serving all stakeholders, and we have to be responsive to them, they were the least stakeholder oriented in their responses. Now, the one nuance which is interesting is that the signatories to this statement that did not have a history of stock buybacks and high dividends, they behaved more like non-signatory firms. They actually responded pretty well when the pandemic hit. But the ones that had spent a lot of time and a lot of money just trying to generate shareholder wealth, they're like, batten down the hatches. Like, we don't know what's going on. We got to protect our shareholders, and stakeholders sort of, you're on your own here. And so it was kind of a dispiriting set of findings, but in some ways it kind of makes sense, right? Like, if you analogize, like an individual person to a company, and the analogy only stretches so far, but it's not bad for this purpose. But imagine, you've been eating junk food your entire life, and then you make this proclamation. You tell all your friends and your family, I am on a diet. I'm going to start doing well. I realized that my previous diet was unsustainable, and I need to do better, and I'm pledging to it very publicly. And then 2 days later, your aunt dies. It's like, oh my God, I mean, this is awful. What do I do? I'm so stressed. And then you eat a bag of Oreos, right? Because it's your fallback, right? Like, you default to the earlier behavior patterns. And I think that's what was going on with the roundtable signatories, right? We picked up some evidence that immediately after signing that declaration, there was an uptick in the amount of stakeholder focused rhetoric on like earnings calls, right? So they were at least talking the talk. But then when COVID happens, I think it makes total sense that they defaulted to past behaviors. Like, oh my God, like, the world is falling apart. And then, what do? You do what you did before, right? Because you don't know any other way. And so you see this, really big snapback effect. We need to get tighter around that mechanism and see if that's really what was driving it. But that's, that's my hypothesis right now.
No, that is very fascinating as a piece of I would say, as kind of a deep dive into what's happening, not just in terms of the people, but also in terms of the culture of organizations and how that plays through. And as we wind down this session, one of the things that I'm very curious of is we see right now, and again, I think this is something that you've mentioned in your previous sessions, that there is a huge rise in awareness about how companies should participate and give back to the communities that support them in one way or another, whether that's through an ESG focus, whether that is through their relief focuses, or whether it's a call for more social enterprises to be formed at the grassroots level. I feel like all around, especially Gen Zs, they are demanding companies have their social responsibility in check. But at the same time, for many corporations, that's not the current culture that is in place. And of course that's nothing wrong with that in a sense. They were alive or at least they've been running for like some of them hundreds of years even, so obviously they're doing something right. But that's just a cultural, I would say, mismatch with what's happening with the new people who are very vocal about how their company should behave and the current culture of companies out there. And I am a total pessimist in this, but I believe that with the rate the world is headed, we may have to anticipate more and more disasters at some level or another, whether that's in climate, whether it's another pandemic, a zombie apocalypse, I don't know. But I believe that there will be opportunities for us to see that conflict come out in a sense. Where do you think the world is headed in terms of, number one, the formations of social enterprises? Do you think this is going to be the next way businesses should be run, or is this a trend that will phase out? And what do you think this means for existing companies out there who are maybe not as competitive and maybe not as socially responsible?
So, soothsaying is tough because there's so much uncertainty. But I mean, here's my take on it. I can tell you like the state of affairs now and how I see this generalizing. So shortly after I got tenure, I wanted to get a fix on what the level of excitement about like social enterprise was among student entrepreneurs. And not even student entrepreneurs that necessarily define themselves as social entrepreneurs, but students who were seriously starting ventures. I wanted to understand what their goals were, right? Like how many of them were like I was when I was that age, just want to, create private wealth versus, who's more like, the way I see the world and enterprise these days, which is, like, let's see if we can do both in some way that, creates a personally fulfilling balance for the entrepreneur. And I was blown away because 70% of the founders that I got in touch with, and it was the full sample of everyone who had gone through any of the co-curricular venture programs here at Penn. So like the VIPC, VIPX, all of that stuff. So over 70% of them said that they had defined social goals in their enterprise and were as interested in creating social impact as they were in creating profit. Now, there's going to be some social desirability in those responses, right? And it's not perfectly predictive of how people will behave when their back's against the wall and they have to make decisions about, day-to-day operations of the venture. But what it tells me loud and clear is there is a lot of interest in this as something that articulates with, the whole self, right? And so I really see, especially amongst the entrepreneurs that I'm excited to work with, they want to bring more than just, sort of this financial professional aspect to their work, right? And that's what draws them to entrepreneurship, right? They call the shots and they can do it the way they want. And so they can infuse their values, morals, and ethics into the organization and try and create some impact in a way that would be harder to do in an established organization. So I think that that's going to continue. And I think that to the extent we can build out ecosystem supports that help people with that, it's only going to encourage it. You also see, the big tailwind being, a lot of, ESG investing, but more importantly, like impact investing and impact VC, where there are pots of capital now and big growing pots of capital that are being dedicated to supporting socially impactful businesses. Now, there's a lot of greenwashing in this space, a lot of impact washing, but, at the end of the day, if you have money that's plunking down, actually making bets on ventures where one of the screens is, what's the impact? This is a good thing, right? And it's going to encourage more people to try and, go down that path. So I think, a good thing. And I think, sort of the macro trends are lining up behind an increase in social enterprise, at least in the immediate future.
Okay. I shall rejoice. Any other critics of social enterprise may weep from your soothsaying. And final question before we end for today, and let me just say, I'm personally having so much fun in this interview that I'm very sad that we're at almost the end. But final question, in a sense, for all social entrepreneurs watching right now, what do you think they need to actually succeed?
Well, they need all the same stuff that traditional entrepreneurs need. They just need some special versions of it, right? Like they need mentors, advisors. They obviously need, to have an idea, a team. They need financial resources. But what they need really is, an ecosystem that's designed to support them and the goals that they're going after, as opposed to, them trying to sort of fit their square peg in the round hole of the, the profit-seeking venture supporting ecosystem, right? So there's a lot of supports that are out there for traditional entrepreneurs. But I think that, what social entrepreneurs need to succeed is those dedicated resources, right? They need, support and training for how to, understand what their impact is, how to measure it, assess it, make sure that they're actually creating impacts as opposed to just assuming they're creating them and then maybe not, or even doing some harm, which you've seen some social enterprises do. And you need people who can help them understand how their goals articulate with each other, where they're symbiotic, where they pull apart, and where the trip lines might be as they try and actually grow and scale these ventures. So I'm optimistic that this stuff is getting built. And my final comment here would be, the undergrads, especially at a place like Penn, are uniquely well equipped to do this because just as sort of a class of people, so smart, ambitious, hardworking, and socially conscious. It's a tough path, but when you have smart people who are willing to walk down it, great things can happen.
All right. Well, thank you. And I like that last point on, it's not about fitting into the existing resources, but finding those that actually support the work that you do it and enhance it and be able to see that impact beyond just the predictions that we don't have now yet. And I hope that all of the social entrepreneurs and students watching this are inspired to continue their track in this world of crazy world of entrepreneurship, specifically with the focus of doing good. So thank you so much for being on the show. I hope that you had as much fun as me and our audience listening to you. And like, I really appreciate you taking your time to do this.
Oh, my pleasure. It was great to be a part of this, Harsha. Thanks for inviting me. And, I really did enjoy our chat.
All right. And with that, hopefully our audience did too. And if you guys enjoyed today's show, please let us know in the comments, give us a like. And if you guys would like to tune into more amazing sessions like this, remember, we're on every Thursday at 10 p.m. ET. Till then, bye.
You're listening to Changing Reality. Changing Reality, where we bend reality all across the world. Only on WQHS Radio.